Welcome to Old Heart Stories. The air in Plaquemines Parish hung thick and wet, a palpable, suffocating blanket woven from Spanish moss and the steam rising perpetually off the dark, churning water of the bayou. It was June 1891, and the Gilded Age might have been showering New Orleans with gaslight and diamond stick pins 20 miles north, but here, where the cypress roots twisted like arthritic fingers into the muddy earth, life was raw, immediate, and often deadly. The scent was intoxicating and ancient, wet decay, the sweet, cloying fragrance of jasmine that bloomed too aggressively, and the faint, metallic tang of the Mississippi silt. Hidden deep within a curtain of emerald green moss, Isabelle pushed her flat-bottomed skiff with practiced silence. Her arms, lean and strong, worked the paddle in short, precise strokes. She wore practical linen, a faded blue shirt and trousers tucked into boots, a uniform utterly divorced from the corseted constraints of the world she sometimes visited for her cargo. Under a waxed canvas sheet in the center of the boat lay her contraband: several glass bottles of quinine mixed with alcohol, a large jar of crude petroleum jelly, and rolls of sterilized gauze that had cost her 3 precious silver dollars. She did not smuggle liquor or silks. She smuggled hope, poorly packaged and highly illegal. Isabelle's face, usually animated by a practical determination, was currently shielded by a broad-brimmed straw hat. Yet a fine sheen of perspiration dotted her temples, collecting on the wisps of dark hair that had escaped her tightly coiled braid. She knew the dangers of the bayou, the alligators, the water moccasins, the sudden shifts in current, but those were merely natural obstacles. The true danger followed the mapped routes, carried a badge, and sought to enforce laws written by men who had never known the feverish desperation of a mother watching her child succumb to malaria. She paused, allowing the skiff to drift into a tiny shadow-choked inlet. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, scanned the dense vegetation. She wasn't paranoid, she was cautious. For the last 6 weeks, the warnings from her network had been consistent: a new face. An agent, federal, rumored to be relentless and cold, hunting the source of the unauthorized pharmaceutical trade feeding the parishes. They called her the shadow healer in hushed tones. The law called her contrabandista. Just 3 miles downriver, disguised among the dense willow oak canopy, Agent Daniel Hawthorne sat motionless. Daniel, unlike the local law, was unnaturally crisp. Despite the suffocating humidity that should have melted the starch from his white collar, he maintained an appearance of formidable composure. He was dressed in serviceable wool, a necessary evil for protection against the insects, though it felt like wearing a furnace. And his movements were minimal. His hands gripped the cool brass frame of his field glasses, trained on the precise location he knew the smuggler used to cross the main artery. He did not believe in shadows or folklore. He believed in evidence, ledgers, and statutes. Daniel was the son of a Boston magistrate, educated in the stringent application of the law, and he regarded the emotional chaos of the South with a detached professional disdain. His current assignment was clear: shut down the illegal trade of medical supplies. It wasn't just the lack of tariffs, it was the quality control, the regulation. The rule of law was the only thing preventing chaos, and the woman who ran this operation was actively undermining order. He focused the lens. The heat shimmer made the air above the water dance, distorting shapes, but he saw her clearly now. A profile, momentary, before she vanished again behind a hanging curtain of moss. He had expected a man, a rough, scarred rogue motivated by pure profit. Instead, he saw a woman whose movements were too graceful for heavy labor, yet too deliberate for leisure. She handled the boat with the familiarity of a spouse. Isabelle Dubois, he muttered, tasting the French inflection. His dossier was meager. She was listed as a widowed teacher or a seamstress, depending on the source, but the details were deliberately vague. What was certain was the volume of goods moved and the infuriating success of her evasion tactics. He watched as she secured the skiff to a cypress knee, careful to tie the rope below the waterline where the knot would be harder to spot. Then she retrieved a small, leather-bound journal from the bottom of her cargo. She dipped a pen into a tiny inkwell and wrote something rapidly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Daniel adjusted his position, the rough bark of the oak tree scraping against the back of his neck. His focus sharpened, trying to glean information from the ledger. Was it pricing? Contacts? He saw her glance toward the setting sun, then press her hand flat against the waterlogged wood of her vessel, a gesture that seemed oddly reverent, almost a benediction. It occurred to Daniel for the first time in 6 weeks of frustrating surveillance that the woman was operating alone. There were no armed guards, no dock hands, no signs of the organized criminal network he had been assured was funding this operation. He mentally dismissed the thought. It was irrelevant. The law did not recognize intent, only action. Smuggling was smuggling, regardless of whether the funds lined a silk pocket or bought bread for the poor. His duty was his anchor in this slippery, morally ambiguous landscape. A sudden, sharp cry of a nearby heron shattered the silence. Isabelle's head snapped up. She didn't hesitate. She plunged the journal back under the canvas, grabbed her paddle, and pushed the skiff hard back toward the open water, vanishing instantly into the thick, humid haze. Daniel cursed under his breath. He had been so engrossed in observation, he'd lost his tactical advantage. He scrambled to his feet, pulling the light Colt pistol from its holster. He knew he couldn't fire, not without escalating the situation unnecessarily and potentially endangering the very people he was supposed to protect from harm, even if those harms included illegal medicine. He ran along the muddy bank, fighting the clinging mud that tried to steal his boots. He reached the edge of the water just as the ripples of her passing began to subside. She was gone. Again. Frustration was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He found a small, half-buried track, the faint scrape of her skiff against the mud, and knelt. There, embedded near the water's edge, was a tiny object, a smooth, gray river stone, obviously chosen for its distinctive coloring, placed precisely where he would see it. It was a sign, a marker meant for someone else, indicating a change in delivery location. Daniel picked it up. It was still damp, cool against his palm. He stood, looking out over the immense, shifting expanse of the bayou. This wasn't merely a chase, it was a chess match, and he was beginning to suspect his opponent was playing by an entirely different set of rules. Isabelle didn't stop paddling until the oppressive canopy of the main bayou was replaced by the relatively open marsh leading toward the shrimper shacks. She allowed herself a few deep, ragged breaths, the heavy air stinging her lungs. She knew she had been spotted. That cry of the heron was too sharp, too immediate. It was the signal used by old Jules, who watched the river approach from his leaning shack. The new federal agent was not clumsy. He was patient, and worse, he was learning her rhythm. He wasn't like the bumbling local deputies, eager for a bribe and a nap. This one was meticulous. She had seen the way the moss had been ever so slightly disturbed by a heavy foot near the channel entrance, and the faint scent of pipe tobacco that hadn't quite masked the smell of polished leather. She reached her destination, a small, dilapidated wharf that seemed to be actively sinking into the water. Old man Boudreau was waiting, leaning against a post, his face etched with worry and humidity. "He was close, Isabelle, too close," Boudreau whispered, helping her secure the skiff. "I know, Jules. Did you see his face this time?" "No, but his clothes, they looked military, dark, neat, too clean for the bayou. He is relentless. You must be careful, child." "Relentless pays no mind to duty when people are dying, Jules." Isabelle pulled the canvas back, revealing her vital cargo. "How is Marie's son?" "Worse. The fever holds him. If you had come an hour later." He didn't finish the sentence, but the desperation in his eyes spoke volumes. Isabelle quickly separated the quinine bottles and measured a dose for Boudreau, carefully instructing him on administration. She didn't charge him. Boudreaux didn't have a centime to his name, just labor in the sweltering sun. As she handed over the precious medicine, she saw Boudreaux's hand tremble. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was the sheer, crushing weight of gratitude. "Isabelle, you are risking too much." "We risk everything by doing nothing, Jules," she replied, pulling out her little leather journal. She didn't write down debts owed. She wrote down names, symptoms, and the inventory that needed immediate replenishment. She made a mark next to Boudreaux's name, no charge, quinine administered. It was this journal, she knew, that would hang her if she were ever caught. It was the evidence of her crime and the irrefutable evidence of her singular purpose. She pushed back into the current, turning her mind immediately to the next stop. The danger was escalating, but so was the need. The rice fields had flooded 3 weeks prior, and the inevitable cycle of fever was sweeping through the camps. She couldn't stop now, not when the consequences of stopping meant death for those who had no other recourse. As the late afternoon sun finally began to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the water, Isabelle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The federal agent was closing in. She could feel his presence, cold and rational, tracking her movements like a bloodhound on a fresh trail. She didn't know what he looked like, but she knew his spirit, duty. And she knew her own, justice. The clash she felt in her heart was now inevitable. And she knew, too, with a curious certainty that unsettled her more than any lawman's threat, that when they finally met, the collision would be catastrophic, for both of them. She only hoped that when the federal agent saw the suffering faces his law ignored, he would find himself facing a crisis of conviction greater than any indictment he could draw up. But Daniel Hawthorne, miles away, stood by the riverbank, his jaw tight, reviewing his evidence. He saw the stone marker, calculated the route change, and felt only the keen, exhilarating challenge of the hunt. He had one task: bring the contrabandista to justice. And in the oppressive heat of the Louisiana summer, duty felt absolute, unyielding, and entirely free of moral ambiguity. He would not stop until he had her in irons. The woman was efficient, yes, but he was the law, and the law always prevailed. He just needed to get close enough to see past the shadows and find the true motive driving the shadow healer. What he would find, however, was something far more dangerous than profit: a profound, defiant heart. The air was thick, suffocating, hanging heavy with the smell of stagnant water and decaying cypress. Daniel Hawthorne moved through the Bayou night with the silent efficiency of a predator. He was tracking a ghost, a woman known only by the small miracles she left behind, and the trail of discarded legal warnings she ignored. He had followed the signs, the subtle shift of a broken reed, the unusual displacement of a stone marker near the water's edge, and they had led him to a small, dilapidated shanty deeper in the swamp than any sane soul would venture. A single oil-soaked lantern cast a pale, weak light from a window, making the shadows outside long and monstrous. Daniel pressed his back against the damp wood, listening. He heard no sounds of illicit trade, no whispered dealings of profit, only the shallow, strained gasping of someone desperately ill, and a woman's soft, steady voice speaking in Creole, low and rhythmic, like a prayer. He drew the heavy Colt revolver from his holster. The brass gleamed faintly in the moonlight filtering through the moss canopy. This was the moment, the culmination of 3 months of relentless pursuit. He kicked the door inward. The sound was immense, tearing the silence apart. Daniel stepped into the gloom, the gun leveled, his breath held tight. "Federal agent, drop whatever you are holding. You are under arrest, Isabelle Dubois." The scene that greeted him was not the profitable lair of a criminal, but a tableau of human misery that stopped the words hard and cold in his throat. Isabelle, recognizable instantly by the defiant lift of her chin, was kneeling by a crude cot fashioned from sacks. She held no weapons. She was pressing a steaming compress against the forehead of an old man whose face was gray with fever and whose breathing sounded like tearing silk. Scattered around her were small, stoppered glass vials and dried herbs, not stacks of smuggled gold. She did not flinch or scream. She merely turned her head slowly, her eyes, the color of deep Bayou water in the summer, locking onto his. There was no fear in them, only deep, incandescent exhaustion and a profound pity that seemed to encompass both the dying man and the agent standing over her. "Agent Hawthorne," she said, her voice a low contralto that demanded attention, even in crisis. "You have arrived precisely when I cannot spare a moment for your law." Daniel felt the absolute certainty he had carried for months begin to dissolve, melting like frost in the Louisiana heat. The sight was a punch to the gut. This was not a profiteer. This was a healer working without gloves, without protection, giving away the only resources she had. "Stand away from the patient," Daniel ordered, trying to sound like the uncompromising man he was, but the command was fractured by the terrible rattling cough from the cot. "The charges are smuggling, distributing illegal narcotics, and obstruction of federal inquiry. I must take you into custody now." Isabelle carefully adjusted the compress, her focus unwavering. "I am distributing quinine, agent, not narcotics. Quinine that the poor cannot purchase from the pharmacies in New Orleans who fix the price at the cost of a working man's week's wages. I am distributing life. If you arrest me now, this man dies before dawn. Is that the justice you serve?" He took a step forward, his boot crunching on dried leaves. "The law is not contingent on individual morality. It is the structure that prevents chaos. Your actions undermine the regulated system. And the regulated system starves them. It ignores them. Look around you, Agent Hawthorne. Do you see gold? Do you see stacks of money earned from suffering? I see fever, filth, and fear. I see people abandoned by the society you claim to uphold." Isabelle rose slowly, placing herself between Daniel and the sick man. Her stance was one of protection, a desperate shield. He lowered the muzzle of the Colt an inch, the heavy weapon suddenly feeling clumsy, heavy with the weight of absolute duty. "I see defiance of the federal government. I see contraband." "Then you are blind, agent." Isabelle's voice trembled slightly, the strain of the night finally showing. "Or perhaps you simply choose to be. If I were a man dealing opium for profit, I would welcome your condemnation. But I am risking everything, my freedom, my life, to offer a small measure of mercy where your system offers only a death sentence." The confrontation hung in the oppressive air, distilled and agonizing. Daniel's mind raced, his meticulous training screaming one directive: "Arrest her, the evidence is clear." But his eyes were fixed on the deep, truthful ache in her face. He had hunted her for months, imagining a cold, calculating criminal. He found instead a desperate saint, driven by a fury so pure it was terrifying. He was the law, she was the justice, and they were standing at the precipice of an impossible choice. A different sound then sliced through the night. Not the sharp crack of a federal raid, but the muffled thrum of a small skiff approaching the remote landing spot. The boat engine was quiet, but the men aboard were not. Daniel instantly recognized the signature sound of a local outfit, notorious for dealing in adulterated medicines and exploiting the very desperation Isabelle was fighting. They were the true profiteers. Isabelle's eyes widened, recognizing the threat instantly. "The Menard outfit," she whispered, her hands flying to gather her precious vials. "They heard the door break. They think I have been compromised, or perhaps they think they can collect payment for the last shipment by force." Daniel's blood turned to ice. He was not just facing an arrest, he was facing a potential ambush. He was alone, deep in the swamp, and now caught between the woman he was supposed to apprehend and the criminals he was supposed to be infiltrating. How many, Daniel demanded, professionalism overriding personal turmoil. 3, maybe 4. They are ruthless. They deal in misery, Agent. If they find me here with this medicine, they will assume I stole it, or they will take it for themselves and leave the sick to die. Daniel looked at the woman, her face illuminated by the flickering oil lamp.
Duty, cold and absolute, whispered, "Arrest her now, while you still can." But justice, warm and insistent, roared, "Protect her, she is doing the right thing." The boat engine cut. Silence. Then the heavy, deliberate crunch of boots on the muddy bank just outside the shanty. There was no time for deliberation. There was only time for action. Daniel holstered the Colt. The heavy leather sound was the final breaking of his duty. He turned to Isabelle, his voice low and urgent, the tone having shifted from prosecuting agent to desperate partner. "Get your patient to safety. Hide him. They are not looking for me. They are looking for you and the quinine. I will draw them away from the shanty." Isabelle stared at him, bewildered by the swift, irreversible change in his allegiance. You were letting me go?" "No," Daniel ground out, his jaw rigid. "I am not letting you go. I am deputizing you. You are now assisting a federal agent in the apprehension of genuine criminals. That man outside, the one who profits from the suffering you are trying to alleviate, he is the true violation of the law." He grabbed the nearest heavy object, a small empty wooden crate, and hurled it across the room against the far wall with a tremendous, distracting crash. "I am making a noise," Daniel whispered fiercely, pulling Isabelle down into the shadows beside the wall. "They will assume the fight started inside. When they enter, you slip out the back with your patient and disappear into the water. If I survive this, Isabelle Dubois, I will find you again." Isabelle stared at him, bewildered by the swift, irreversible change in his allegiance. You are letting me go?" "No," Daniel ground out, his jaw rigid. "I am not letting you go. I am deputizing you. You are now assisting a federal agent in the apprehension of genuine criminals. That man outside, the one who profits from the suffering you are trying to alleviate, he is the true violation of the law." He grabbed the nearest heavy object, a small empty wooden crate, and hurled it across the room against the far wall with a tremendous, distracting crash. "I am making a noise," Daniel whispered fiercely, pulling Isabelle down into the shadows beside the wall. "They will assume the fight started inside. When they enter, you slip out the back with your patient and disappear into the water. If I survive this, Isabelle Dubois, I will find you again." Isabelle's hand went instinctively to his arm, gripping the thick fabric of his jacket. Their eyes met. Two powerful opposing forces finally aligned against a shared threat. In that instant, surrounded by the stench of sickness and the menace of violence, the boundary between lawman and fugitive did not just blur, it vanished entirely. All that remained was the shared, reckless beat of two hearts caught in the impossible geometry of duty and desire. "And when you find me, Agent Hawthorne," she murmured, her breath warm against his ear, "will it be to put the chains on me, or to join me in the fight?" Daniel felt the sheer, exhilarating precipice of his life's turning point. He had abandoned his life's work, his moral code, and possibly his career in the span of 30 seconds, all because he could not look away from the truth reflected in her eyes. "When I find you," Daniel promised, his voice rough with emergent feeling, It will be because I cannot bear to be anywhere else." He pushed her toward the dark, narrow back door. "Go, now." The heavy footfalls paused just outside the shanty door. A deep, guttural voice called out in patois, "Isabelle, we know you're in there. The agent finally got you, eh? Well, we'll see who takes the spoils." Daniel took a deep, steadying breath, drew the Colt again, and stepped into the center of the room, ready to meet the men who had just saved him from making the biggest mistake of his life, arresting the woman he was beginning to believe he loved. He knew, absolutely, that he was entering the fray not as a federal agent seeking justice for the government, but as a man defending the woman who had redefined what justice meant. The law would have to wait. The true fight had begun. It was the scent that defined their new life. The thick, verdant perfume of cypress and dark, silty water, cut sharply by the dry, medicinal tang of crushed thyme and feverfew drying on muslin cloth. It was the antithesis of the dust and polished brass of Washington offices, and yet, to Daniel Hawthorne, it felt irrevocably like home. A year had slipped into the Bayou's slow, deliberate current since the night the shanty door had been kicked in. A year since Daniel had traded the unyielding weight of the badge for the precarious, exhilarating burden of true justice. The chaos of that night had burned itself out quickly. The actual ring of thieves and counterfeiters, exposed by Daniel's testimony and Isabelle's detailed knowledge, had been rounded up. Daniel had fulfilled his duty, only not in the manner his superiors would have approved. His resignation, submitted by wire 2 days later from a telegraph office smelling of stale tobacco and regret, had been accepted without fanfare, noted simply as a departure due to irreconcilable differences in the interpretation of federal mandate.
He had lost everything: his career, his carefully constructed reputation, his predictable future. But he had gained everything else. He stood now on the small, warped plank porch of a little white house, perched high on stilts on the dry edge of a quiet, forgotten parish. The house was hers, now theirs, patched together from the remnants of old barges and reclaimed lumber. The air was heavy, humid, and quiet, save for the hum of insects and the distant rhythmic creak of Isabelle's rocker coming from inside. Daniel was measuring and cutting thick lengths of rope, securing a supply crate intended for the distant, isolated communities deeper in the marsh. The ones that still feared the sight of a government boat, the ones Isabelle served. His hands, once trained to the precise calibration of a Colt revolver and the careful folding of official documents, were now calloused by carpentry and the rough handling of medical supplies. He was still methodical, still fiercely protective of inventory and logistics. He had become the structure that buttressed Isabelle's necessary chaos. He paused, resting his forearms on the porch railing, looking out over the water where the morning fog was burning off the black mirror of the bayou. "You are watching the water again, Agent Hawthorne." Isabelle's voice drifted out, rich with the warmth of the morning. He smiled, a genuine, easy expression that had taken root only since he had shed the armor of his duty. "It's a fine habit. You taught me that the law is not what is written on paper, but what protects the most vulnerable among us. I am merely watching the boundary of our jurisdiction, Mrs. Hawthorne." She appeared in the doorway, leaning against the jamb, watching him. She wasn't wearing the dark utilitarian skirts of the fugitive anymore. Her dress was faded blue cotton, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing forearms dusted with flour from grinding roots. Her hair, usually confined in a tight braid, was loose and wild around her shoulders, shining copper in the sun. She had fought her own battle after the dust settled, a brief, agonizing legal scrutiny where her actions were weighed not against the profits of the criminals, but against the lives she had saved. With Daniel's meticulous record-keeping of every transaction and recipient, a habit he had forced upon her, she had been absolved. The judge, an old man who knew the harsh realities of the Bayou better than the lawmakers in Baton Rouge, had issued a simple admonition. Continue your good work, mademoiselle, but perhaps employ a bookkeeper to manage the legalities. That bookkeeper was now Daniel. He walked toward her, closing the short distance with the deliberate purpose that still defined his movements. He stopped just shy of touching her, admiring the line of her throat, the way her eyes, once wary and darting, now met his with unwavering trust. "When you first described me," Daniel murmured, running a thumb gently along her jaw, "you called me an executioner in a tweed coat." She laughed, a low, melodic sound. "And you were, rigid, unbending, every line of your life drawn straight and true. I believed you hated everything wild." "I only hated the wildness I didn't understand. I hated anything that defied my definitions," he admitted, resting his forehead against hers. "You showed me that the definition was wrong. Justice is not the absence of mercy, it is the application of it." She closed her eyes, inhaling the scent of him, clean linen, damp air, and the lingering aroma of the pipe he smoked in the evenings. "I was afraid you would never forgive yourself for abandoning your principles." "My principles were narrow, Isabelle. They were walls. You didn't make me abandon them. You forced me to expand them until they encompassed everything real." He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her easily and spinning her once before settling her down again, pressing her back firmly against the rough wood of the doorframe. The heat of the morning was already rising around them, thick and immediate. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly, her hand smoothing the wrinkles from the fabric covering his chest. Daniel tilted his head, considering the question deeply. He remembered the feeling of that heavy brass badge over his heart, the certainty it provided. It was a potent memory, sharp and almost painful, like recalling a dream. "I miss the clarity," he conceded.
Life was simple. Follow the law, arrest the offender. But clarity often obscures truth. What I feel here, Isabelle, he placed her hand over his heart, which thumped a steady, vigorous rhythm, is not clarity. It is certainty, the kind that doesn't require a law book or a federal mandate. They had married quietly 3 months after the fight, in the little church that Daniel had helped them restore in the next parish. He had worn a simple dark suit, and she a dress the color of Spanish moss. The whole congregation, composed of people she had healed and people Daniel had stopped chasing, had gathered to witness the impossible union. Now, their life was a pattern of meaningful labor. He spent his days in the small office he had built, cataloging the medicines, writing letters to distant philanthropists for donations, and, always, watching the waterways. He carried a firearm still, not a government-issued Colt, but an old, reliable Winchester, used only for protection, a silent reassurance that the lawlessness they fought was now external, never internal. Isabelle's apothecary thrived. She was the one true doctor for miles, combining old patois knowledge with modern pharmaceutical understanding. She no longer had to sneak through the swamps in the dark. The sick came to her, bringing payment in eggs, salted fish, or honest labor. "We have become terribly respectable, Daniel," she teased, running her fingers over the new wedding ring on his hand, a heavy plain band of gold that felt sturdy and real. "It is unavoidable," he countered, capturing her hand and bringing it to his lips for a long, slow kiss. "When a federal agent marries a contrabandista, we must, out of necessity, establish a new definition of order. I am merely ensuring that the foundations of our home are sound." He pulled her into the full embrace, the quiet intimacy of their connection eclipsing the morning heat and the demands of the day. "You told me once that the biggest mistake a lawman can make is confusing the law with justice," she whispered, resting her chin on his shoulder.
And you taught me that the biggest mistake a man can make is confusing duty with true devotion, Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion. He held her tight, grounding himself in the living reality of her presence. He thought back to the moment he had stepped out of the shanty, gun drawn, choosing her truth over his old life. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been the only truly correct decision he had ever made. He had expected the Bayou to feel like exile. Instead, it felt like grace. He had expected to feel haunted by the ghost of the principled agent he had been. Instead, he felt fully alive, a man finally aligned with his own truth. The sun climbed higher, warming the porch boards beneath their bare feet. A skiff needed loading, tinctures needed bottling, and patience would soon arrive. Their work, the work of mending broken things, bodies, laws, and hearts, was endless. Daniel loosened his embrace slightly, but kept her close. He looked down at the woman who had dared him to be better, who had forced him to look beyond the letter of the law and into the very soul of justice. "Go on, mon cœur," he urged gently, echoing the soft term of endearment he had picked up from the local tongue, a language that spoke of emotion and connection rather than cold fact. Isabelle lifted her face to his, her eyes shining with the hopeful, defiant light that had first drawn him across the impossible chasm between them. Daniel kissed her forehead, a promise sealed against the humid air. "The agent, my darling Isabelle, is retired. He is merely the man who carries the supplies, protects the perimeter, and makes sure the woman he loves never has to run again." And in the heart of the slow, mysterious Bayou, two souls, once defined by the opposite poles of duty and desperation, finally found their shared center, building a love as enduring and deeply rooted as the ancient cypress trees surrounding their home. The true fight had begun that night, but the true peace had settled forever after. Thank you for watching Old Heart Stories. Please subscribe for more stories from the past.